Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Well, we Brexited and the sky didn't fall in. The pound is stable, indeed climbing, and the FTSE 100 is going through the roof.
No one is asking for anyone already here to depart. Calls for a second referendum are dissipating. Demands, legally impossible in any case, for Parliament to overrule the people have been rejected by the government and opposition alike.
Sensible people, however they voted, are therefore turning their attention to the opportunities which will now open up for Britain in the wider world, including China. One such is the Teaching Fellow of International Development at King's College London, Mark Stanford, and I'm glad to say he joins us now. Let's deal with China, which I know is your special area, Mark, first of all. The possibility now exists, doesn't it, for Britain to conclude trading arrangements with all the other countries in the world, most of them, who are not in the European Union. Indeed, trade happens whether there are trade deals or not. We've been trading with America for a long time without any trade deal at all. But is China a particular focus, you think, for British manufacturing and exports?
Well, I think China has to be a focus because well, really for two reasons. One, they're of course continuing to grow faster than most of our other trade partners. And even though they're experiencing a slowdown, that's likely to continue.
It's a slowdown that we would love to have ourselves. Yeah?
Absolutely, yes. But the second reason really is that they are currently transitioning from an economy which is relatively undeveloped to a richer economy which has higher demand, particularly for services, and that's what we have been exporting to them. That's what we're particularly good at still, and so there's enormous potential to expand our export of services to China as they grow.
What kind of services? English language, high tech, financial services and so on? Is that what you have in mind?
Well, the two areas that we are really good at the moment, in particular, are financial services, for one thing. Of course, Britain, apart from just being an international clearinghouse for many transactions around the world, Britain is also a center of financial innovation, which is something that China lacks. So we have that to offer. But I think there's maybe even more potential in the area of research, because Britain is, in fact, the single most efficient producer of research in the world, pound for pound, both scientific and non-scientific research. China is a country which is getting a bit anxious about its research capacity. There's a worry that if they don't start inventing their own technology, their own approaches to things, then they'll stagnate. They'll be stuck in what's called the middle income trap.
Well, the fintech industry here in London, which I was only quite recently introduced to, is extraordinarily impressive. How have we come to be so good at that? You would have thought that Silicon Valley, the United States and so on, you would have thought that they would have cleaned up.
Well, I suppose it's a combination of two factors, really. One is the increasing, some would say, over-specialization in financial services.
I would
as well. Over-specialization in financial services since the 1980s. So obviously that's brought a great deal of talent here to work for that industry. But I think also that industry has benefited from Britain's really quite extraordinary academic institutions and research institutions generally. So the two feed into each other. In
one way, I'm quite glad to hear you say that, especially if there's a big market for it in places like China. The BRICS generally, of course, some of them are up, some of them are down, but the long term, you would have imagined that the BRICS economies would be where the sun was rising. We must have a potentially good future with them.
Yes and no. So, of course, arguably, whether or not we talk about the BRICS as a whole, of course, the center of gravity of the world is shifting toward Asia. It's inevitable now, really, that this will happen. There is a big question mark, however, about not just Britain's role in that new world, but the whole of Europe, actually. What do we really have to sell in this new world that's going to set us apart? And the optimistic prediction is that we'll continue being good at what we do. Maybe we'll diversify our economy and learn new things to offer. The gloomy view is that China, India, other powers can learn to do good science. They can learn to do all of these things, and they won't need us anymore. And there is a narrative among some Chinese nationalists that says, with some degree of smugness, that Europe is now sinking into irrelevance and will become the world's #1 destination for museums and castle tourism and nothing else.
I think that there's something in that, but now that we're leaving the European Union, we don't have to go down with them.
I mean, you talk about the BRICS. What about the Commonwealth, to which Britain has actually already a historical special relation in that case? What prospect, if not political, financial prospect, do you see with them?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the potentially very exciting things about the possibility of negotiating our own trade agreements, because of course there's a lot more growth going on in particularly developing Commonwealth countries. Yeah. When we look at the century ahead, we're talking about clear growth both in across Asia and indeed in Africa. There's enormous potential because of obviously the resources that are present. So it would be an enormous mistake to miss out on those relationships. Yeah.
Now, despite all that, you're not really wholeheartedly a Brexiteer. You favour a new Norway-style relationship. Tell us how that would look.
Well, the Norway model, as people have called it, really just means that we honour the result of the referendum completely. We leave the European Union, but we remain in the single market. What that means is that we regain the vast bulk of the sovereignty that was pooled. We do away with the vast majority of European regulations, and we withdraw from a whole array of institutions and policies which were designed for a project of political integration. But at the same time, we retain the benefits of the single market. So in a way, I'd say it's the best of both worlds.
But there are two crucial caveats to that, aren't there? One, we would have to keep paying in, as Norway does, and other countries, Switzerland does. And perhaps most controversial of all, we'd have to continue to allow free movement of labour. And it's probably free movement of labour that tipped the balance for the exit vote.
Well, I think on the issue of payments, first of all, I think this issue of all the very legitimate concerns people had during the debate, I think this was a bit of a red herring, to be honest, because the amount
it was eye-catching. It
was eye-catching. It was eye-catching. £10 billion net sounds like a very big figure. Of course, the British government spends something like $770 billion a year, so this is really, around 1%, a bit more of government spending. The amount of GDP gain that comes from being in the single market is much more than £10 billion a year. So we're paying a small fee and we're getting a big return for that fee. It's really a bit of a non-issue, I think.
You're right. The free movement of labour is the big enchilada.
Yeah. So on free movement of labour, there are possibilities, and I think these are going to have to be explored as much as possible in the next couple of years, of trying to negotiate a different kind of settlement. Now, there are two ways that this could happen. One way is what you might call the Liechtenstein solution. So Liechtenstein is also...
My goodness, it'll be the Schleswig-Holstein question next.
So Liechtenstein is also...
Does anyone know the answer to the Schleswig-Holstein question?
It's beyond my area of expertise. Yeah. Liechtenstein is also in this grouping, along with Norway and Iceland, that we would be joining. Outside of the EU, but in the single market. And they have negotiated a special deal where they're allowed to, even within the single market rules, put a quota on the number of workers they receive every year. And it's quite a small quota. It was originally intended to be temporary, but they've renewed it over and over again, and it's effectively permanent. This was justified on the basis of the special conditions of Liechtenstein and their desire to preserve their cultural integrity and so on. Now,
it's a big culture, Liechtenstein. You've got to admit.
Iceland also falls in there, no?
Iceland,
yes, but don't all these countries have one thing in common? They're extremely small. To allow Britain an exemption, a country of 65 million which had just exited, would be pregnant with enormous political implications in the rest of the EU.
Yes, there's going to be enormous opposition to any kind of deal like this. So I don't think we should count on it, but it's something that should be attempted, should be explored. The other possibility, which some people have suggested, and I think is perhaps a bit more realistic, is to try to negotiate a reframing of the idea of free movement on a wider scale. It doesn't necessarily have to be for the whole of the EU. It could just be for the countries in this smaller grouping, for example. The EEA agreement, which governs these countries, by the way, doesn't provide for free movement of unemployed people, students. It actually only allows free movement for workers who already have a job offer. Now, that's been extended since through the Free Movement Directive, but I think there's a real possibility for a negotiation arguing toward the original principle, at least for this group of countries.
It is quite surprising to me that the EU holds quite so tightly to this free movement shibboleth. It wasn't, of course, in the original model of a common market, or even when it became the wider EEC. And in any case, that wasn't a difficulty, because in the early days, the community was composed of countries of roughly similar economies. It was the expansion of the EU and the political integration that begat the free movement shibboleth. I'm still a bit surprised that they hold so firmly to it.
Well, I think, of course, there are many different currents of thought within European politics, European political institutions. And you do have diehard federalists who believe in the idea of creating a European citizenship such that eventually, in theory, the flows of people should equalize all these countries. And there are, of course, neoliberals as well who just believe in opening markets.
Yes. The only people who believe actually in free movement of labour are liberals, Trotskyites, and Ayn Rand. Unfortunately, Mark, we've got to finish there. Mark Stanford, you've helped us a lot. Thank you very much for coming on the Sputnik.
Coming up next is the former mayor of London and a leading Labour figure for almost 40 years. It's Ken Livingstone. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Jeremy Corbyn has been through hell in the last week. They tried to, quote, break him as a man, unquote. I know what that feels like, and so does our next guest. He is a man who needs no introduction because he is Ken Livingstone. Ken, let's start with what Jeremy has been through. We both know that no one could be kinder, gentler, more inclusive a person than Jeremy Corbyn. From a personal perspective, it's been breaking my heart all week. How did you feel?
It's just appalling, because Jeremy became leader. He reached out to all his critics, the people that didn't vote for him, brought them into a very broad-based shadow cabinet. He allowed them a free vote on Syria. He's not been, imposing a bit of whip.
He kept Hillary Benn as the shadow foreign secretary.
Against it, all that. And now they've been stirring up. So we had all the allegations of anti-Semitism, which they thought would damage the local election results, and that would trigger a leadership challenge, but it didn't. We did quite well. And then it's this nonsense of blaming Jeremy because we've voted to leave the European Union. And it's a smear campaign, and it's been depressing to watch. So many of these MPs actually go off in a huff and start demanding he goes. But don't forget one thing. For the 4 elections under Blair and Brown, local Labour parties weren't allowed to select the candidate they wanted. They had to choose an approved list that'd been vetted to keep people like you and me out, So gradually the number of genuine Labour socialists in the parliamentary parties whittled away as we've retired or died. And it was almost impossible for any new ones to come in. So Jeremy's inherited a parliamentary Labour Party so skewed to the right.
So far to the right, to the one we were in.
Yeah. I mean, so different.
When we entered, there was at least 100 people, working class, trade unionist, socialist MPs. At least 100.
And, I mean, literally, the combination of the Tribune Group and the Campaign Group, the two main left-wing groups, was about half the parliamentary party. But now, I mean, no one, gets in. They all come through, college, get their degree. They're an advisor to an MP. They've not worked in the trade union movement. They've not served in local government. It's just so they're out of touch. So many of them. I mean, I think don't really have a good contact with working class people anymore.
They think Swarfiga is a Greek island. It was quite a pantomime. All the dames were brought out on the last day. Dame Margaret Hodge, Dame Margaret Beckett, Dame Harriet Harman, and then even Dame David Cameron joined in.
The interesting thing, when Cameron calls on Corbyn to go, I think that's every reason why we should get him to stay. Because although this is nonsense, he lost the referendum. We've had 4 by-elections, and in each of those by-elections, under Jeremy, the swing to Labour has been big enough to put a Labour government in office. Yes. When people face that choice, whether it's this autumn or in 4 years' time, between 4 more years of this Tory government and its awful policies, or Jeremy, who's talking about a very different and fairer Britain, I think Jeremy will win.
Well, exactly. All those are all indicators that he is electable, and that's why he gets this storm against him.
I mean, the trouble is that I think there's a lot of these embittered old Blairite MPs can't come to terms with the fact the last Labour government was a terrible disappointment, not just on invading Iraq and Afghanistan, but failing to create good jobs for working class people. It was all about what the bankers wanted. All the wealth went up to that small elite at the top, and ordinary people are much worse off than they now were 35 years ago. They really struggle. And that's how it's the same in America. That's why there's the anger, the people supporting Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. They just see the politics in the West has been a small elite. You change the government, but broadly the same sort of people carry on the same sort of policies.
Absolutely. Now, turning to the report on anti-Semitism, in which you are quite unfairly dragged in. It has now reported. You've been vindicated. And your suspension must now be lifted, surely.
Well, I just finished reading the report. It's fairly long. And Shami Chakrabarti is a woman of real integrity and intelligence. She demonstrates there's no problem with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. But the really important thing, she's making real rule changes being proposed, and Jeremy says he's going to carry them out. Never again must we allow unelected party bureaucrats to suspend party members without even checking whether what's happened is true. I mean, I was up before the House of Commons Home Affairs Committee, and just before me was the chairman of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. In his opening he says, for Ken Livingstone to say that Hitler was a Zionist was so offensive, he should apologise. Well, if I'd said that, I wouldn't just apologise, I'd go to my doctor to check I wasn't in the beginning of dementia, How can anyone think Hitler was a Zionist? He hated Jews. I mean, it's just appalling, and I hope these rules will come through, because it isn't just me. There was a woman who was suspended because she drew a parallel between the Holocaust and the slave trade. Well, the number...
And that woman was herself Jewish.
Yes. And we've just had a situation where, because I can't stand for the NEC because the closing date for nominations has passed, the Left Caucus came together. We proposed a young woman who's actually been a Zionist in Zionist organisations, and in her local party, the local MP argued she shouldn't be nominated.
Ex-MP.
Yeah, ex-MP. Now, that's not because he's anti-Semitic, it's because she supports Jeremy, and that's all this round's been about.
Yes.
And those MPs who are smearing me as anti-Semitic, what they really hate is I defend Jeremy.
Yes, quite so. Anti-Semitism exists. It's overwhelmingly a phenomenon of the right. There are, and I've met them, some sections of the Muslim community who idiotically fail to make the distinction between Judaism and Zionism. The religion actually demands that they respect Judaism, yet they sometimes conflate the two. A very small number. I, like you, I was in the Labour Party for almost 40 years and would have been in it now if I hadn't been expelled over 50 years. I have never met an anti-Semite in Labour politics. It's actually an oxymoron.
I mean, why would anyone who's anti-Semitic join a party that's committed to challenging every form of racism and sexism? Now, I've never heard an anti-Semitic comment in 47 years. I last heard a racist comment in 1970. And I have to say, sadly, I do occasionally hear sexist comments. We've still got a long way to go on tackling that.
Yeah.
But no, if someone was anti-Semitic, they wouldn't have joined a Labour Party led by Ed Miliband for 5 years, who was himself Jewish.
Yes. Now, your old adversary, Boris Johnson, has, in the last hours, announced that, after all, he will not be our next Prime Minister. He's history now, I think, and probably will retire to write it. Are you shocked at what's happening in the Tory party?
Well, I mean, I'm glad to see Boris go, because he would have been a disastrous Prime Minister. He doesn't do the job. I mean, when he was mayor, he appointed a deputy who was a former Tory council leader, and he got on running the machine whilst Boris was off promoting himself. I think Boris realised that he wasn't going to get enough Tory MPs nominating him to get into that final two that the party made, because most Tory MPs have watched his 8 years as mayor and realised he's not really Tory or anything. Yeah. He's just about promoting himself. He should have gone into show business.
He's a showman, yeah.
But the trouble is, a choice between Theresa May and Michael Gove is just a nightmare.
Except for Jeremy. I mean, from Jeremy's point of view, I'd rather face one of those, Tweedledee, Tweedledum. I think that Theresa May is obviously a worthy, competent person, but dull. A bit like John Major in a dress, and we know how his career...
But Gove, now that's scary. He has an ideology which would turn us into a sort of mini-America. It would be horrendous. He would roll back. I mean, under a Gove premiership, I think you could say goodbye to the NHS. We'd be moving to something like America.
You see him more as the neocon candidate.
Absolutely. Yeah? And the trouble is, he does focus on detail. He would really make change, and he'd turn Britain into a much less pleasant society. So let's hope we have an early election.
Ironically, I must tell you, when I was attacked and hospitalised by a supporter of Israel who went to prison for 16 months for it, the only top-line politician who crossed the road, got out, stopped his car, got out and crossed the road to commiserate with me, was Michael Gove. So on a personal level...
Well, I once had a drink with Nigel Farage. That doesn't mean to say I'm going to support him either.
Well, I can say I've never had a drink. I never will have a drink with Nigel Farage. Last question then. Are we in for an early election? Isn't it unarguable? Certainly Cameron made the argument when Gordon Brown took over, that you can't just sit there as the Prime Minister without the public endorsing you.
It's House of Cards there.
It's exactly how Urquhart became president.
Yes.
Without a vote being cast. Democracy is so overrated. Don't you think the demand for an early election will become unanswerable?
I think it will, because you're going to have years of negotiations about this, how we negotiate leaving. And I think to do that, the person's got to have the legitimacy of having the backing of the British people. And you can't just rumble on for another 4 years before the people get a chance to say whether do we want Gove or May, or do we want Jeremy Corbyn? You know, that's what democracy should be about. I mean, the big mistake Gordon Brown made was not going for that election immediately after he became Prime Minister.
He would have won.
He would have won. And I think the longer they put it off, the better Labour's chance of a good majority will be. So but I'd still want to see it quickly. I mean, we are in such a mess.
Yeah. Well, you left Parliament far too early, as I told you at the time. Any chance of a comeback?
Oh, well, I'm 71 now. I mean...
But you look 51.
You're so kind. But no, I mean, I'll do whatever Jeremy wants me to do, but I have to say, I'm a house husband. I mean, my wife's the teacher. I have to get the kids off to school, walk the dog, do the shopping.
Well, that's admirable. But your country needs you. And your party needs you. Ken Livingstone, thanks for coming on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So as we've just spoken to the China expert Mark Stanford, we asked the question, will the People's Republic become the UK's key ally now in this post-Brexit era? Glenn says, well, a lot more people live there and business is business.
Well, that's right. Of course, there are more people live there than in any other country. We do seem to have quite a good relationship with China. It's part of what I think will be our future, of looking around the world for new markets and new customers and building new relationships without trying to interfere in their internal affairs and placing sanctions on them and so on.
So business is business.
Business is business.
Well, that's all that we've got for today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us through Twitter, RT_Sputnik, or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.